we're going to move on to our last formal speaker of the morning session, Bill Hartung, at the Center for International Policy, without doubt the kind of nation's expert on the military and nuclear military industrial congressional complex that drives all this madness. Max, please take the mic.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Sorry, Cole. Yeah, no, it was quite an honor to be called Max. So thanks, Jonathan and Cole and all the organizers and my co-panelists. It's an honor to join you all today. So I'm going to talk about the nuclear weapons industrial complex. And I think, for context, we've heard about the dangers of nuclear winter, dangers of accidental nuclear war. The United States has close to 6,000 nuclear weapons, when a few hundred would be enough to deter any country from attacking the United States. And of course, deterrence itself is a risky proposition. We really should be eliminating nuclear weapons altogether, as is called for under the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty that came into effect yesterday. And within the nuclear arsenal, for example, we have intercontinental ballistic missiles, which a president would, under current plans, have to decide whether to use within a matter of minutes in a crisis. We could easily have an accidental war through false alarm. Bill Perry has called these some of the most dangerous weapons in the world for that reason. And yet, despite all this, despite the risks, despite the fact that these are things that not only aren't making us safer, but they're threatening the future of life as we know it, the Pentagon is scheduled to spend up to $2 trillion on building a new generation of nuclear-armed bombers, missiles, submarines, and new nuclear warheads to go with them over the next 3 decades. So the nuclear weapons industrial complex is in this for the long haul. They're making investments now that they'll profit from for decades to come. So how do we deal with this complex? How does it operate? It's really a case of special interests versus the human interest. And one pillar of this lobby is something called the Icbm Coalition, which consists of senators from the states that are hosting ICBM bases, or where a lot of the maintenance of the ICBMs is done. And these are smaller states like North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. And yet their senators have carried enough weight to be able to block any kind of change in US policy on ICBMs. They managed to keep 400 ICBMs in the arsenal under the New START treaty. They've got this concept of, quote, warm silos, where instead of destroying the few silos that were empty after New START, they want to keep them ready in case there's a buildup so they can immediately put more missiles in them. They've blocked environmental studies of eliminating unused silos. And more importantly, they've blocked any kind of studies, exploration of alternatives to building new nuclear ICBMs or the possibility of eliminating them altogether. All that has been taken off the table in significant part due to this small number of senators and the relationships they've built in the Congress, and of course the support they receive from institutions like the nuclear weapons contractors. And of course, that's the second pillar of the nuclear weapons industrial complex. And Northrop Grumman, in the case of ICBMs, is the leader because it received a $13.3 billion contract last year, sole source, no other bidders, to build a new ICBM, which in the wonderful language of the Pentagon is called the, well, I won't tell you what it's called. It's just adding more jargon to the mix. But anyway, they've got their own little antiseptic name for it. But anyway, Northrop Grumman is claiming 10,000 jobs related to the development of this system, which in a workforce of 160 million people is sort of an afterthought. But they've spread them around to a couple dozen states. Members don't like to vote against jobs in their districts or states. They're using the jobs argument as leverage to move forward on this thing. But of course, the dirty little secret is any other investment of money would create far more jobs. If you spend it on green energy, you spend it on infrastructure, you spend on health, you spend on education, things that actually would make us safer and more prosperous. you'd get 1.5 to 2 times as many jobs as spending it on ballistic missiles. So we need an alternative to be built. And the new administration is already talking about things like a public health corps of 100,000 workers, major investments in green technology and addressing climate change. These are the kind of things that can employ people so they don't have to be employed building weapons of mass destruction. So Northrop Grumman is not alone in this. They've got a dozen major subcontractors also lobbying to spend more on nuclear weapons. And they include a lot of heavy hitters, the biggest weapons contractors like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon Technologies, Aerojet, and others. And when Representative Ro Khanna brought an amendment in the House last year to cut $1 billion from the ICBM budget, those companies managed to blanket the Armed Services Committee with lobbyists and defeat that amendment. So they're at the ready to try to prevent us from doing what needs to be done to eliminate nuclear weapons. And of course, they have great tools to do this with. They spend millions of dollars on campaign contributions to members of Congress, especially members of the Armed Services and Defense Appropriations Committees, because they're the ones who make the decisions about the money, whether it's going to keep flowing. Just those dozen contractors that work on the ICBM employ 380 lobbyists, almost one for every member of Congress. And those lobbyists are deployed as needed to block important initiatives to rein in the nuclear danger. And it's not just the ICBM lobby, the other legs of the nuclear triad have their own constituency. So you've got the Air Force Association, which is a huge organization lobbying to build more bombers, funded in large part by defense contractors and ex-military people. You've got a thing called the Submarine Industrial Base Council, which says it represents 4,000 companies in 50 states that build components of ballistic missile and attack submarines. And they have these Washington days where they go in and talk to members about the jobs in their states and districts building nuclear submarines. So these are the kinds of forces that we're up against. And so I guess the question is, what is to be done? You know, how do we kind of untangle this? How do we win this battle for sanity, really? And I think, you know, first of all, of course, we have to have, I think, ambitious demands. So I think the ban treaty coming into force this week is a good guide to where we need to be and where we need to go. I think in terms of the Biden administration, we should press for a review of this nuclear modernization program, a critical look at why on earth is there a $2 trillion plan to build more newer nuclear weapons. I think one of the first things to go should be intercontinental ballistic missiles. We shouldn't be building new ones. They shouldn't be in the arsenal. Global Zero, an organization some of you may be familiar with, has an alternative nuclear posture that talks about a deterrence-only strategy, weapons only enough to deter other countries from attacking the United States as a first step towards total elimination of nuclear weapons. I think that would be an interim goal that could be pressed for. And I think, you know, the thing that we have on our side is we have much more urgent priorities. We have to deal with the pandemic. We have to deal with the threat of climate change. We have to deal with the rise of racial and economic injustice to much more visible levels than we've seen, longstanding problems that are coming to the surface. And those things are all going to require public investment. And so we can't afford to spend $2 trillion on nuclear weapons when we've got other work to be done to make our society safer, more prosperous, and more democratic. And I think, you know, the alternatives are pretty stark. If you look at the ICBM alone, we're talking about $264 billion to build and deploy those things and the warheads that go with them. That would be enough to pay for free public college for anybody who wants it, and also bring everybody who's not covered by health insurance onto Medicare. So there's real benefits to be had from shifting our priorities. Or as the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons pointed out, if you took what the United States spends every year on nuclear weapons, invested in public health, you could create 300,000 more beds in intensive care units, build 35,000 ventilators, employ 150,000 nurses, 75,000 emergency room doctors. So that's just one example of where the money could do good if it was invested more constructively. And of course, we need political reform. We need to get contractors out of the business of funding our Congress. We need to stop the revolving door. We've got people going in and out of government from the defense industry. Our current Secretary of Defense came from the board of Raytheon. The prior Secretary of Defense, other than the guy who just filled in a couple months there for Trump, was a lobbyist for Raytheon. The prior Secretary of Defense was an executive at Boeing. And James Mattis was on the board of General Dynamics, went right back there after he left the Trump administration. So you've got this kind of nexus of people who profit from the perpetuation of military spending and nuclear weapon spending. And we've got to break those connections. I did a little look at the executive compensation of these companies. Under the Trump administration, for the top 10 contractors, their CEO compensation on average increased by 50%. So just the CEOs alone of those companies were raking in a couple $100 million a year, which is not a lot of money compared to that $2 trillion, but it's indicative of misplaced values. They make hundreds of times of what the average worker makes, putting forward policies that risk the future of the planet. So I think I'll leave it at that. And thanks again to the organizers, and thank you all for being here. We've got a lot of good work to do today, and I'm glad to be here for part of it.
Thank you, Bill. Very, very helpful, sober account of what we're up against. I just want to remind people this is extremely profitable business making these weapons because it's a monopoly. It can't be outsourced to Chinese or Mexican contractors. The congressional appropriations have in it guaranteed profit margins. And of course, you can't find out what it actually costs the companies because national security veils all these contracts. So, and it's brilliant, right? Our taxpayers' dollars are used to buy off our congressmen year after year after year. They have a great deal. So we're going to open up. We have a big crowd. We're going to open up